Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. My name's Deputy Ben Walker. These days most folks around here just call me the crazy old man with the shotgun, but I earned my badge honestly, serving the Whisper Falls Sheriff's Department for 15 years before everything went sideways. Back then, I was 32, divorced, and convinced I had life figured out. Funny how wrong a man can be. Whisper Falls, Colorado isn't the kind of place you find by accident. Nestled deep in the Rockies, population barely breaking 2,000 during ski season, we're the definition of a backwater town. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where the biggest excitement used to be catching teenagers drinking at the old quarry or breaking up the occasional bar fight at the Rusty Pike. I remember exactly how it started. The weather that spring had been unusually wet, turning the mountain trails into treacherous mudslides. When the Reeves couple from Denver went missing off Trail 23, nobody thought much of it. Tourists get lost all the time, take a wrong turn, ignore the warning signs. Search and rescue found their backpack caught on a branch near Widow's Creek, their rental car still parked at the trailhead. No bodies, though. That should have been our first clue. A week later, the Johnsons disappeared. Now that was different. Frank and Martha Johnson weren't tourists. They'd lived here since before I was born. Every morning like clockwork, they'd walk their ancient golden retriever up to the ski resort and back. The dog came home alone that Tuesday, whining and covered in mud. We found their walking sticks snapped in half about a mile up the trail. The town started talking then. Whispers about mountain lions, maybe a rogue bear. But I'd worked these mountains long enough to know predator signs. There were no tracks, no blood, no torn clothing. Just people vanishing into thin air, leaving behind nothing but questions and a growing sense of unease. I was working late that Friday night, catching up on paperwork from the Johnson case. The station was quiet, just me and the gentle hum of the ancient coffee maker in the break room. Sheriff Mills had gone home hours ago, leaving me to lock up. It was 0:32 when I heard the first noise. At first I thought it was just another raccoon in the dumpsters. We'd been having trouble with them all summer, clever little bastards figuring out how to pop the lids. I grabbed my flashlight, not even bothering with my gun. 15 years on the force, and I'd never needed to draw it outside the shooting range. Another mistake. The alley behind the station was narrow, barely wide enough for our patrol cars to squeeze through. A single bulb flickered above the back door, casting weird shadows across the crumbling brick walls. The smell hit me first, like meat left too long in the sun, mixed with something chemical and wrong. My nose wrinkled as I swept the flashlight beam across the dumpsters. That's when I saw it. You know how your mind sometimes refuses to process what your eyes are seeing, like there's a disconnect between reality and what you're willing to accept as possible? For a solid 10 seconds I stood there trying to make sense of the shape huddled between the dumpsters. It looked almost like a pile of old clothes at first, or maybe a large dog curled up in the shadows. Then it moved. I've seen my share of horror movies, always thought I knew how I'd react in a situation like that. But when that thing unfolded itself, rising up and up and up until it towered over me, all my training, all my experience, it all went right out the window. The creature was impossibly tall, easily 7 feet if it was an inch, with limbs like pale tree branches, too long and too thin to be human. Its skin hung loose on its frame, wrinkled and wet-looking in the dim light. But the head, Jesus, the head! It was massive, swollen like some grotesque balloon, hairless and misshapen. 2 enormous eyes reflected my flashlight beam, bloodshot and intelligent in a way that made my skin crawl. Below them was a mouth that split the thing's face almost in half, filled with row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. It made a sound then, a wet, bubbling hiss that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside its twisted body. I stumbled backward, my flashlight clattering to the ground. The beam spun wildly, catching glimpses of that horrible face, those hungry eyes. My hand went to my hip, searching for my gun, but found only an empty holster. With stunning clarity, I remembered leaving it on my desk, next to the half-finished report about the Johnsons. The creature moved like nothing I'd ever seen before, dropping to all fours and scuttling towards me with an almost mechanical precision. Its joints bent in ways that shouldn't be possible, long fingers clicking against the pavement like tap shoes from hell. I ran. I'd like to say I made a tactical retreat, that my training kicked in and I executed some kind of professional response to the situation. But the truth is, I ran like a scared kid, pure adrenaline carrying me out of that alley and onto Main Street. My lungs were on fire, heart hammering so hard I could hear it over my own ragged breathing. The streets weren't empty, thank God for small mercies. A group of tourists was stumbling out of the Rusty Pike, laughing and loud in that particular way of people who've had a few too many. I tried to warn them, my voice cracking as I waved frantically at the alley. Help, there's something. The words died in my throat as the creature emerged from the darkness. It moved like a spider, those impossible limbs carrying it faster than anything its size had any right to move. The tourists' laughter turned to screams as it launched itself forward, that massive head swaying on its thin neck like some obscene pendulum. The group scattered, but one woman wasn't fast enough. She tripped on the uneven sidewalk, her high heels betraying her at the worst possible moment. The creature was on her in an instant, those spindly arms wrapping around her body like a twisted straitjacket. I saw her face in the streetlight, young, probably mid-20s, absolute terror etched into every feature as that gaping maw descended towards her. The gunshot caught us all by surprise. The creature reeled back, a shriek like tearing metal splitting the night air. I looked up to see Old Man Harris standing on his second-floor balcony above the pharmacy, rifle raised and smoking in the dim light. Harris had been the town pharmacist for longer than I'd been alive, a quiet man who mostly kept to himself. Now he stood like an avenging angel, chambering another round with practiced ease. The creature seemed to hesitate, its huge head swiveling between Harris and its fallen prey. Then, with a movement almost too fast to follow, it grabbed the woman in its jaws. Her scream cut off abruptly as those teeth closed around her, and then she was gone. Just gone, swallowed whole like a snake taking down its prey. The monster turned and fled back towards the alley, moving with that same impossible speed. Another shot rang out from Harris's balcony, and the creature screamed again, but didn't slow down. In seconds, it had vanished into the darkness, leaving behind nothing but the echo of its shriek and the lingering smell of rotting meat. I found myself standing beneath Harris's balcony, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stay upright. The other tourists had gathered in a tight knot nearby, their faces pale and shocked in the streetlight. Nobody spoke. What could you say after seeing something like that? Finally, someone whispered, "What the hell was that?" The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with implications none of us wanted to face. Harris's voice came down from above, rough and commanding. "You get back inside, boy. Gonna be a long night." I should have listened, should have run back to the station, called for backup, done anything except what I did next. But something in me had snapped. Maybe it was the woman's final scream, or maybe it was 15 years of routine suddenly shattered by something impossible. Whatever the reason, I couldn't make myself move. Harris must have seen something in my face, some reflection of the stubborn determination I was feeling. He grunted, "Get up here then. Help me keep watch." The tourists fled back to their hotel rooms where they could pretend what they'd seen was just a bad dream brought on by too much alcohol. I made my way up the narrow stairs to Harris's apartment above the pharmacy, my legs still shaking with each step. The place smelled like medicine and old wood, with a hint of something else, gun oil and whiskey. Harris didn't waste time with pleasantries. He handed me a steaming mug that definitely wasn't coffee, then gestured to a chair on the balcony. We sat in silence, rifles across our laps, watching the street below. The night seemed darker now, the shadows deeper and more threatening. "Been seeing them before," Harris said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Years ago. They come in cycles, thin spots in the world letting them through." "Thin spots?" The whiskey burned in my throat, but it helped steady my hands. He nodded slowly, eyes never leaving the street below. "Places where the veil between worlds wears out. My granddaddy fought 'em in 42. I was just a kid then, saw them snatch folks right out of their homes." "Why Whisper Falls?" It seemed like a stupid question, but I needed something to make sense in this suddenly insane world. Harris took another sip from his mug. Used to be a mine back in the day. Old-timers talked about weird stuff being dug up, accidents happening. Always figured it was just ghost stories. He paused, his weathered face tight with memory. Maybe not. The rest of that night stretched on forever. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound made us tense. Those eyes haunted me, those huge, intelligent, hungry eyes. We fired off warning shots whenever we caught glimpses of movement in the darkness, but the creature was patient. It would wait us out, wait for a moment of weakness. Morning came eventually, bringing with it Sheriff Mills and half the county's emergency response team. They found what was left of the tourist woman up near the ski resort. Wasn't much to find. The official report called it a bear attack, a tragic accident. People wanted to believe that explanation. Hell, part of me wanted to believe it too. But I'd seen those eyes. I'd heard that wet, bubbling hiss. And Harris, he'd seen too much in his long life to pretend it was anything other than what it was. The world had changed for us. Or maybe we'd just finally seen it for what it really was. The aftermath was almost worse than the encounter itself. Nobody wanted to talk about what happened. Sheriff Mills put me on administrative leave, said I was suffering from severe shock. Maybe I was. The nightmare started then. Dreams of that twisted body, that massive head, those rows of needle teeth. Harris became my anchor in those early days. We formed an unlikely partnership, the old pharmacist and the suspended deputy. We set up a watch schedule, taking turns patrolling the town, especially around the old quarry where the mine entrance used to be. We knew more creatures would come, drawn by whatever thin spot or portal existed in our little corner of Colorado. The town didn't take kindly to our vigilance. Whispers started circulating. Harris was a senile old man. I was a traumatized cop who'd finally cracked under pressure. Sheriff Mills called me into his office one morning, said he was sorry, but he had to let me go. The badge I'd worn for 15 years suddenly meant nothing. But it didn't matter. I had a new job now, one that didn't come with a pension or health benefits, but felt more important than anything I'd done before. Harris taught me everything he knew about the creatures, how they moved, how they thought, how to spot the signs before they attacked. We lost more people over the years. The creatures were clever, patient. They'd watch and wait, sometimes for weeks before striking. But we got better at fighting them too. Harris had this theory that they couldn't stand certain frequencies, high-pitched sounds that made them retreat back into whatever hell they'd crawled out of. 10 years have passed since that first night in the alley. Harris is gone now, passed away in his sleep 2 winters ago. His old rifle hangs above my fireplace next to my own collection of weapons. The town keeps getting smaller. Folks move away to the city looking for places where monsters are just things in movies and books. But I stay. Somebody has to. Whisper Falls isn't the sleepy little mountain town it used to be. These days we get a different kind of tourism, the kind that comes in the night with glowing eyes and too many teeth. I reckon this is where they'll find me when my time comes. Old shotgun in my hands, facing down those bloodshot eyes one last time. The hardest part isn't the fighting. It's not the long nights of watching and waiting, or even the moments of terror when you catch a glimpse of something moving wrong in the shadows. No, the hardest part is knowing that most people will never believe you, never understand what's really out there. I keep a journal now, recording everything I can about the creatures, their habits, their patterns, the ways they move and hunt. Sometimes I think I'm the only one left who remembers what really happened that night, what's still happening in the darker corners of our town. The tourist woman's name was Catherine Chen. She was 27, a software engineer from Seattle on vacation with friends. I looked her up afterward, needed to know who she was, make her more than just another victim. Her family still thinks she was killed by a bear. Sometimes I wonder if that's better, if knowing the truth would only make their loss harder to bear. Harris left me everything when he died. His apartment above the pharmacy, his weapons, his notes. Turns out he'd been keeping records for decades, tracking the creature's appearances back to the 1940s. The old mine features prominently in his research. Something was found down there, something that shouldn't have been disturbed. I've tried going into the mine, but the entrance collapsed years ago. Maybe that's for the best. Some doors are better left closed, some mysteries better left unsolved. but I can't help wondering what's down there. What kind of thin spot could let these things through into our world? The creatures are evolving, adapting. They're getting better at hiding, at blending in. Sometimes I catch glimpses of them trying to mimic human movement, walking upright instead of that spider-like scramble. It terrifies me more than their natural state, the idea that they might be learning, studying us. Last week I found tracks near the old Johnson place, not the usual kind. These looked almost human except for the spacing and depth. Something heavy walking on legs that were too long, trying to pass as normal. I set up cameras, but they never show anything. Either the creatures don't show up on film, or they're smart enough to avoid being recorded. The town's down to 1,200 people now. The ski resort closed last season. Couldn't keep enough staff. Too many disappearances, too many accidents that couldn't be explained away. The teenagers don't go to the quarry anymore. Seems they've developed better survival instincts than their parents. I patrol every night, walking the same routes Harris and I established years ago. The old pharmacist's rifle is retired now, hanging above my fireplace more as a memorial than a weapon. I use something with a bit more punch these days. You learn what works and what doesn't when you've been fighting monsters as long as I have. The creatures don't like silver, oddly enough. Not that it kills them. I'm not sure anything can truly kill them, but it seems to hurt them, drive them back. I keep silver bullets for emergencies when running isn't an option. They're expensive, hard to come by, but worth every penny when you're staring down one of those twisted faces. Sometimes I wonder if I should leave, find somewhere normal to spend whatever years I have left. But I can't. Whisper Falls is my home, my battlefield. I'm the last line of defense, the crazy old deputy who knows what's really out there in the dark. Besides, who would believe me? Who would take up the watch if I left? The world isn't ready to know about the things that slip through the thin spots, the creatures that hunger for more than just flesh. So I stay, and I watch, and I fight when I have to. Let them come. Let them try to drag us back into their darkness. They'll find we bite back harder. Because that's the thing about small towns. Sometimes we've got more stubbornness than sense, more fight than fear. And me? I'm just the guardian, the keeper of secrets too terrible for most folks to handle. The last defender of a town that's slowly being eaten away, not just by monsters, but by the weight of knowing last night. Something changed. I was doing my usual patrol, checking the perimeter near the old mine entrance, when I noticed the smell. That same sour meat stench from all those years ago, but stronger, more concentrated. The air felt wrong, heavy with static like before a thunderstorm. The collapse that sealed the mine wasn't natural. Harris and I made sure of that back in 15. Too many creatures coming up from those depths, too many close calls. We used enough explosives to bring down half the mountain, or so we thought. But as I stood there in the darkness, I could hear something shifting beneath the rubble. My flashlight beam caught movement in the shadows, not just one pair of those bloodshot eyes, but dozens. They were gathering, more than I'd ever seen in one place. The beam reflected off pale, twisted limbs and swollen heads, all of them swaying slightly like branches in a wind I couldn't feel. I did what Harris taught me, stood my ground, raised the silver-loaded shotgun and waited. The creatures watched me, their huge eyes unblinking. Then something else emerged from behind them, something bigger. Its head was massive, even by their standards, skin stretched tight over a skull that seemed to pulse with its own light. It spoke. Not in words, not exactly. The sound bypassed my ears and went straight to my brain, a series of images and feelings that made my nose bleed and my teeth ache. I saw the mine as it was before, saw what the miners found down there in the darkness, saw why the creatures kept coming back, why they needed to feed. They weren't just hunting, they were preparing. The thin spot Harris talked about, it wasn't just letting things through, it was getting bigger. Each person they took, each life they consumed, made the barrier between worlds just a little bit weaker. And now, after all these years, it was finally ready to tear completely. I understood then why Harris had been so adamant about teaching me everything he knew. He must have sensed this coming, known that eventually the creatures would make their final push, the wolf pack descending after years of picking off strays. I had a choice to make. Could have run, warned the town, tried to evacuate. But that would have just spread the problem, given the creatures more hunting ground. Instead, I thought about Catherine Chen, about the Johnsons, about every person these things had taken over the years. I reached into my jacket and pulled out Harris's last gift, a detonator he'd rigged up years ago, connected to charges we'd hidden throughout the old mine system. Insurance, he'd called it. The charges had been down there so long I wasn't even sure they'd still work. The creature leader must have sensed what I was planning. The whole pack surged forward, moving with that terrible spider-like grace. But I had the high ground and years of practice with this particular dance. The silver shots wouldn't kill them, but they bought me the seconds I needed. I wish I could say I had some profound last words, some perfect movie hero line. Truth is, I just smiled, thinking about Harris and his crazy theories that turned out to be right all along. Then I pressed the button. The explosion started deep, a rumble that built into a roar. The ground buckled and split, and then it got strange. The air itself seemed to tear, showing something beyond the flames and smoke. Something I thank God I only glimpsed for a second. The creatures screamed, not their usual shrieks, but something deeper, more primal. Then the whole mountainside came down. I'm writing this from a hospital bed in Denver. They tell me I'm lucky to be alive, that most of the mountain collapsed into the old mine system. Official story is that the abandoned tunnels finally gave way, taking a chunk of Whisper Falls with them. 3 blocks of the old town are just gone, swallowed by the earth. They found me half a mile away, covered in dust and blood, still clutching Harris's old rifle. The doctors say I'm suffering from severe concussion and smoke inhalation. They whisper about PTSD and trauma when they think I can't hear them. But I know what I saw, know what really happened that night. The thin spot is gone now, sealed under thousands of tons of rock and whatever else came through in those final moments. The creatures that survived, and I'm sure some did, will have to find another way into our world. Sometimes at night I still hear that voice in my head, still see those impossible visions. But the dreams are getting fainter, the memories less sharp. Maybe that's for the best. They're rebuilding parts of Whisper Falls, talking about turning it into a proper ski resort town now that the unstable mine situation has been resolved. Young families are moving in, bringing new life to the old streets. Most of them don't know the history, don't recognize the names on the missing persons lists that go back decades. I've been thinking about staying, maybe opening a small security consulting business. Someone needs to keep an eye on things, watch for signs that they've found another way through. Harris would have wanted that, because that's the thing about monsters. They don't just give up. And that's the thing about small town folks. We don't either. We guard our own, keep our secrets, and stand ready for whatever comes next. My name's Ben Walker. I used to be a deputy in Whisper Falls, Colorado. Now I'm something else, a watchman, a guardian, a keeper of darker truths. And if you're ever driving through our little town late at night, and you catch a whiff of something that smells like spoiled meat, or see something moving wrong in the shadows, well, you know who to call. Just don't expect anyone else to believe you. The frosty morning air nipped at my exposed skin as I stepped out onto the weathered porch of my grandparents' cabin. Dew still clung to the grass, sparkling like a sea of diamonds in the early morning light. I took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp pine-scented air that was so different from the smog-filled atmosphere of my urban home. This secluded retreat in the heart of Idaho had always captured my imagination, its isolation both enticing and slightly unnerving. I had arrived at the cabin late the previous night, driving up from Boise after work. My grandparents had long since passed, but the family had kept the property, using it for the occasional getaway. It had been years since I'd visited, and as I stood there, taking in the breathtaking view of the dense forest that surrounded the clearing, I felt a mixture of nostalgia and anticipation. The cabin itself was a testament to my grandfather's craftsmanship. Built with his own hands in the 1960s, it stood as a 2-story log structure, its wood darkened with age but still sturdy. A stone chimney climbed up one side, promising warmth on cold nights. The porch wrapped around 3 sides of the building, offering various vantage points to observe the wilderness. As I sipped my coffee, letting its warmth chase away the morning chill, I made a decision. Today I would explore the woods that had always beckoned to me as a child. Back then, my grandmother's stern warnings had kept me close to the cabin. "Those woods aren't safe for little ones," she'd say, her eyes darting nervously to the tree line. But I wasn't a child anymore, and the mystery of what lay beyond the clearing was too tempting to resist. I went back inside to prepare for my adventure. The interior of the cabin was cozy, filled with rustic furniture and family mementos. Faded photographs lined the walls, showcasing generations of smiling faces set against the backdrop of these very woods. As I gathered supplies, my eyes lingered on a particular image: my grandfather standing proudly next to a massive elk he'd hunted. There was something in his eyes, a wariness that seemed at odds with his triumphant pose. I shook off the unsettling feeling and focused on the task at hand. In the kitchen, I rummaged through the cabinets, packing a small backpack with water bottles, granola bars, and a first aid kit. I found an old flashlight in a drawer and tossed it in as well, though I didn't plan to be out after dark. As an afterthought, I grabbed a worn trail map from a stack of papers on the counter. It was yellowed with age, its creases deep and well-worn, but it might prove useful if I strayed too far. Upstairs, I changed into what I hoped would be suitable attire for a forest trek. My usual city clothes, skinny jeans, and a light sweater were quickly swapped for a pair of cargo pants and a long-sleeved flannel shirt. I laced up the only boots I'd brought, a pair of fashionable leather ankle boots that I now realized were woefully inadequate for serious hiking. Still, they were better than sneakers, I reasoned. Back on the porch, I took one last look at the cabin. A part of me felt foolish for this sudden urge to play explorer. I was a web developer from the city, not some seasoned outdoorsman. What did I know about navigating wilderness? But another part of me, the part that had always longed for adventure, for something beyond the glow of computer screens and the hum of traffic, urged me forward. With a deep breath, I stepped off the porch and made my way across the clearing. The grass was tall, reaching almost to my knees in some places, evidence of how long it had been since anyone had stayed here. As I approached the tree line, I felt a slight hesitation. The forest loomed before me, ancient and imposing. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches intertwining overhead to create a canopy that dimmed the morning light. I paused at the edge of the woods, looking back at the cabin one last time. It suddenly seemed very far away, a tiny island of familiarity in a vast sea of unknown. For a moment I considered turning back, spending the day reading on the porch or tidying up the cabin. But the pull of the forest was stronger. With a small nod of determination, I stepped under the canopy of leaves and into the woods. The change was immediate and profound. The sounds of the clearing birds chirping, wind rustling through the grass faded away, replaced by a deep primal silence. The air felt different too, cooler and heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Shafts of sunlight pierced through gaps in the canopy, creating islands of light in the dim forest. I began to walk, my boots crunching softly on the carpet of leaves and pine needles. There was no clear path, so I picked my way carefully between the trees, using the occasional break in the canopy to orient myself with the position of the sun. I had a vague plan to head east for a couple of hours before turning back, hoping to discover some of the forest's secrets along the way. As I walked, the forest slowly came alive around me. I spotted squirrels darting up tree trunks, their chattering breaking the silence. Once I froze in place as a doe and her fawn crossed my path, their large eyes regarding me warily before they bounded away into the underbrush. The deeper I went, the more I began to relax, feeling a connection to the nature around me that I had never experienced in the city. But as the morning wore on, a nagging sense of unease began to creep over me. The trees seemed to grow larger, their trunks wider and more gnarled. The undergrowth became denser, forcing me to push through bushes and step over fallen logs. More than once I stumbled over hidden roots, my fashionable boots proving their inadequacy with each misstep. By midday I had to admit that I was lost. The sun, now high overhead, was no longer a reliable guide, and the sameness of the forest had me turned around. I pulled out the old map, but it was of little use. The landmarks it showed were nowhere to be seen. and I had no idea where on the weathered paper I might be. As I stood there trying to decide what to do, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was distant but unmistakable, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very air. I whirled around trying to pinpoint its source, but the dense forest played tricks with the sound, making it seem to come from everywhere at once. My heart pounding, I picked a direction at random and began to walk faster, no longer caring about stealth or discovery. The only thought in my mind was to put as much distance between myself and whatever had made that sound as possible. As I hurried through the woods, I became acutely aware of how ill-prepared I was for this situation. My thin flannel offered little protection, and my backpack suddenly felt woefully inadequate. The sound came again, closer this time. I broke into a run, heedless of the branches that whipped at my face and the uneven ground beneath my feet. Panic clouded my judgment, and I no longer tried to keep track of my direction. All that mattered was escape. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I burst into a small clearing. Doubling over, hands on my knees, I gasped for breath. The woods around me were silent once more, but the silence now felt oppressive, laden with hidden threats. As my breathing slowed, I straightened up and took stock of my surroundings. The clearing was unremarkable, just a small break in the endless trees, but as I turned in a slow circle, something caught my eye. There, at the base of a massive oak tree, was a sight that turned my blood to ice. An old, rusted animal trap lay on the ground, its metal jaws open wide and ready to snap shut on any unsuspecting prey. But it wasn't the trap itself that horrified me. It was the fresh blood that coated its teeth and spattered the leaves around it. Whatever had been caught in its cruel embrace had not escaped unscathed. I approached cautiously, my morbid curiosity overriding my fear for a moment. The blood was still wet, glistening in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the leaves. Around the trap, I could see signs of a desperate struggle. The ground was torn up, leaves and twigs scattered in a chaotic pattern, but the most chilling detail was the set of footprints leading away from the trap. They started as clear, crimson impressions in the soft earth, then gradually faded to smears of rusty brown. Whatever had been caught, and it was far too large to have been any normal forest animal, had managed to free itself and limp away. As I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, that growl came again. This time it was close, so close that I could almost feel the vibration of it in my chest. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, I turned around. At the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows of the trees, stood a creature that defied description. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be a nightmarish blend of bear and wolf. Matted fur, caked with blood and some unidentifiable viscous substance, covered its muscular frame. But it was the face that truly paralyzed me with terror. The creature's muzzle was elongated, filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth that glinted in the dim light. Its eyes were the worst part. They were jet black, seeming to absorb all light, but within their depths I saw a cruel intelligence that was all too human. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think. Then, with a roar that shook the very air, the creature charged. Instinct took over. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for direction or stealth. Behind me I could hear the monster giving chase, its heavy footfalls and snapping of branches spurring me to greater speed. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that desperate flight. But eventually I became aware that the sounds of pursuit had faded. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw only empty forest behind me. Still, I didn't stop. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of my situation set in. I was hopelessly lost in a forest that was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. Night was approaching. The light filtering through the canopy had taken on the golden hue of late afternoon, and somewhere out there, a monster straight out of nightmare was hunting me. I slowed to a walk, trying to catch my breath and think rationally. I needed to find my way back to the cabin before dark. But how? I had no idea which direction I had come from, and in my panic, I had left a trail that even I could follow. Broken branches, trampled underbrush, and even, I noticed with a sick feeling, smears of blood where thorns had scratched my arms and face. As I stood there trying to decide what to do, I became aware of a sound. At first I thought it was just the wind rustling through the leaves, but as I listened more closely I realized it was something else. Whispers. Faint, barely audible, but definitely there. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a chorus of hushed voices carried on the chill air. "Don't stay too long," they seemed to say. "You know what happens when night falls." I shook my head, trying to clear it. The stress and fear must be getting to me, I thought. There couldn't really be voices in the wind, could there? But as I started walking again, picking a direction at random, the whispers continued. They grew louder, more insistent, a cacophony of warnings and pleas. "Turn back," they urged, "before it's too late." I tried to ignore them, focusing instead on putting one foot in front of the other. But with each step, the feeling of being watched intensified. It was as if the entire forest had come alive, every tree and bush concealing watchful eyes. The fading light played tricks on my vision, turning shadows into lurking figures that vanished when I turned to look directly at them. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor, I came across another clearing. This one was larger than the last, and at its center stood a circle of standing stones. They were ancient, covered in moss and lichen, their surfaces etched with symbols I didn't recognize. The sight stopped me in my tracks. I approached cautiously, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and desperation. Perhaps these stones were a landmark, something that could help me find my way back to civilization. But as I got closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. At the base of each stone were shallow pits, filled with a dark, decaying organic matter. The stench that rose from them was overwhelming, a miasma of rot and decay that made my eyes water and my stomach churn. And protruding from this foul mulch were what looked horribly like human bones. I staggered back, my mind reeling. What was this place? What kind of nightmarish ritual had been performed here? And most terrifyingly, was it still in use? The whispers in the wind had risen to a fever pitch, no longer just warnings, but a cacophony of anguished cries and desperate pleas. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. It was as if the voices were inside my head, a maelstrom of terror and despair that threatened to overwhelm me. Suddenly, cutting through the whispers like a knife, came a scream. It was high-pitched, filled with a terror so profound that it chilled me to my very core. And it was close. Without thinking, I began to run again. The scream had broken whatever spell the stone circle had cast over me, and now my only thought was escape. I crashed through the underbrush, heedless of the branches that whipped at my face and the roots that threatened to trip me. The scream came again, closer this time. It was followed by a roar that I recognized, the same bestial sound I had heard earlier. The monster was on the hunt again, and this time it had found prey. I ran faster, my lungs burning and my legs feeling like lead. The forest around me was a blur, the fading light turning everything into indistinct shadows. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond putting as much distance between myself and those terrible sounds as possible. But in my panic, I made a crucial mistake. I wasn't watching where I was going, and suddenly the ground disappeared from beneath my feet. I had run right off the edge of a steep embankment. For a moment, I was airborne, and then I was tumbling down the slope, bouncing off rocks and roots, unable to stop my descent. I came to a bruising halt at the bottom, my body aching from a dozen new injuries. For a moment I lay there, dazed and gasping for breath. But then I heard it, the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. Slowly, painfully I raised my head, and there it was. The creature stood at the top of the embankment, its massive form silhouetted against the darkening sky. Its eyes gleamed in the twilight, fixed on me with predatory intensity. Slowly, deliberately, it began to make its way down the slope towards me. I tried to get up, to run, to do anything, but my battered body wouldn't respond. All I could do was watch in horror as the monster approached, its claws leaving deep gouges in the earth with each step. This was it, I thought. This was how I was going to die, alone in these godforsaken woods, torn apart by a creature that shouldn't exist, But just as the monster reached the bottom of the slope, just as I could smell its fetid breath and see the saliva dripping from its fangs, something happened. A piercing whistle cut through the air, followed by a blinding flash of light. The creature reared back, roaring in pain and anger. I blinked, trying to clear the spots from my vision. When I could see again, I was amazed to find an old man standing between me and the monster. He was tall and lean, with a wild mane of white hair and a beard that reached almost to his waist. In one hand he held a gnarled wooden staff, in the other a strange, glowing stone that pulsed with an otherworldly light. "Back, you foul beast!" the old man shouted, his voice surprisingly strong and clear. He raised the stone higher, and its light intensified, causing the creature to shrink back with a pained howl. I watched in astonishment as the monster retreated, slinking back up the embankment and disappearing into the gathering darkness of the forest. Only when it was gone did the old man turn to me, his piercing blue eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something that looked oddly like recognition. "You shouldn't be here, child," he said, extending a gnarled hand to help me up. "These woods are not safe for the uninitiated." I took his hand, wincing as I got to my feet. Every part of my body ached from the fall in the day's ordeal. Who are you?" I managed to ask. "What was that thing?" The old man sighed heavily, suddenly looking every bit his considerable age. "My name is Ezra," he said. "I'm the guardian of these woods. As for that creature, it's something that should not exist in this world. The abomination born of dark magic and darker desires." He looked at me closely, his brow furrowing. "You're one of Margaret's grandchildren, aren't you?" I recognized the family resemblance. I nodded, shocked. "Yes, I'm staying at my grandparents' cabin. But how did you know my grandmother?" Ezra's expression turned grim. "Margaret and I, we shared a burden, a secret, one that I fear you've now stumbled into." He glanced around, his eyes scanning the deepening shadows. "But this is not the place for such discussions. Night is falling, and there are worse things than that beast that roamed these woods after dark. Come, we must get you to safety." Without waiting for a response, Ezra turned and began to walk swiftly through the forest. I hesitated for a moment, my mind reeling from everything that had happened. But the memory of the monster's glowing eyes and razor-sharp teeth was enough to spur me into action. I hurried after Ezra, trying to keep up with his surprisingly quick pace. As we walked, I peppered Ezra with questions about the creature, about my grandmother, about the whispers in the wind. But he remained frustratingly tight-lipped, offering only cryptic responses and warnings to stay quiet and vigilant. The forest around us seemed to come alive as night fell. Strange sounds echoed through the trees, unearthly howls, chittering laughs, and occasionally something that sounded disturbingly like human screams. More than once I caught glimpses of glowing eyes watching us from the underbrush, only to disappear when I tried to get a closer look. Finally, after what felt like hours of trekking through the increasingly sinister woods, we emerged into a small clearing. At its center stood a cottage that looked like it had grown out of the forest itself. Its walls were a patchwork of stone and living wood, with vines and moss covering much of its surface. A warm golden light spilled from its windows, offering a beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness. Ezra ushered me inside quickly, slamming the door behind us and securing it with a series of locks and mystical-looking symbols. Only then did he seem to relax slightly. The interior of the cottage was a cluttered marvel. Every surface was covered with books, strange artifacts, and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling, filling the air with a pungent, earthy scent. In one corner, a fire crackled merrily in a large stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the room. "Sit," Ezra commanded, gesturing to a worn armchair near the fire. As I sank gratefully into its cushions, he busied himself at a workbench, mixing various powders and liquids into a cup. When he was done, he handed the concoction to me. "Drink this. It will help with the pain and protect you from outside influences." I sniffed the liquid cautiously. It smelled like a mixture of mint, earth, and something metallic. Against my better judgment, I took a sip. To my surprise, it wasn't unpleasant. Cool and refreshing, with a slight tingling sensation as it went down. Almost immediately, I felt the aches in my body begin to subside. Ezra settled into a chair opposite me, his blue eyes studying me intently. "Now," he said, "I suppose you have questions." I nodded, not even sure where to begin. What was that thing in the forest, and how did you know my grandmother?" Ezra sighed, running a hand through his wild hair. "The creature you encountered is known as a skinwalker. It's an ancient evil, a being of chaos and destruction that delights in causing pain and fear. As for your grandmother..." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Margaret was more than just a simple cabin owner. She was a guardian like me, tasked with keeping the boundary between our world and others." "Others?" I asked, my mind struggling to process what I was hearing. "You mean there are more worlds than ours?" Ezra nodded gravely. "More than you could imagine, child. Some beautiful beyond description. Others? Well, let's just say that the skinwalker is one of the less horrifying things that can slip through when the boundaries weaken." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "Your grandparents' cabin sits on a convergence point, a place where the veil between worlds is thin. For generations, your family has acted as guardians, maintaining the wards that keep our reality safe. But in recent years, as the old knowledge was forgotten and the wards neglected, things have begun to slip through." I shook my head, overwhelmed. "But why didn't anyone tell me? Why keep this a secret?" "Would you have believed it?" Ezra asked, raising an eyebrow. "Most people prefer to live in ignorance of the true nature of reality. It's easier that way, safer in many respects. But now that you've seen the truth, you have a choice to make." "A choice?" I echoed, a sense of foreboding settling in my stomach. Ezra nodded solemnly. "You can choose to forget. I can provide you with a potion that will erase the memories of today, allow you to return to your normal life. Or..." He paused, his eyes boring into mine. "Or you can choose to embrace your heritage, to learn the ways of the guardians and take up the mantle that your grandmother left behind." I sat back, my mind reeling. The rational part of me wanted to laugh, to dismiss all of this as the ramblings of a madman. But I couldn't deny what I had seen in the forest, the monster, the whispers, the strange magic Ezra had used. It was all real, however impossible it might seem. If I choose to learn," I said slowly, "what would that mean? What would I have to do?" Ezra's expression softened slightly. "It would mean dedicating yourself to a life of service and secrecy, learning ancient magics, facing dangers that most people can't even imagine. It's not an easy path, but it's a necessary one. Without guardians like us, the barriers between worlds would crumble, and unimaginable horrors would be unleashed upon the earth." He stood up, walking to a cluttered bookshelf and pulling down an ancient leather-bound tome. "This was your grandmother's," he said, holding it out to me. "Her grimoire, a record of her knowledge and experiences as a guardian. If you choose this path, it will be your guide." I took the book with trembling hands. It felt heavy, both physically and with the weight of responsibility it represented. As I opened it, a slip of paper fell out, a photograph. I recognized it immediately as the one I had seen in the cabin, of my grandfather with his hunting trophy. But now, looking closer, I could see details I had missed before. The elk wasn't an elk at all, but something far more monstrous. And the look in my grandfather's eyes wasn't wariness, but a bone-deep weariness that I now understood all too well. I looked up at Ezra, 1,000 questions on my lips, but before I could speak, a bone-chilling howl split the night air. Ezra's head snapped towards the window, his expression grim. "It's found us," he said, grabbing his staff. "The skinwalker, it must have followed our trail." Another howl, closer this time. The windows of the cottage rattled, and I could hear something large moving in the underbrush outside. Ezra turned to me, his eyes blazing with an inner fire. "I'm sorry, but your choice will have to wait. Right now we need to fight. Are you with me?" I looked down at the grimoire in my hands, then back up at Ezra. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to run, to hide, to wake up from this nightmare. But another part, a part I hadn't known existed until today, was stirring to life. I thought of my grandparents, of the secret burden they had carried all these years. I thought of the monster in the woods, and all the other horrors that might be waiting to break through into our world. I stood up, my decision made. "I'm with you," I said, surprised at the steadiness in my voice. "Tell me what to do." Ezra nodded, a hint of pride in his eyes. He handed me the glowing stone he had used earlier. "This is a moonstone," he explained quickly. "It channels lunar energy, which creatures like the Skinwalker can't stand. Focus your will through it and it will protect you." He moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "Remember," he said, looking back at me, "the Skinwalker is powerful, but it's not invincible. It fears the light, fears those who stand against it with true courage. Whatever happens, don't let your fear control you. That's what it wants." I nodded, gripping the moonstone tightly. Its cool surface pulsed with energy, almost like a heartbeat. "Ready?" Ezra asked. I took a deep breath, thinking of all that had led me to this moment. The woods that had always called to me, the secrets my family had kept, the horrors and wonders I had glimpsed today. Whatever happened next, I knew my life would never be the same. "Ready," I replied. Ezra threw open the door and we stepped out into the night, ready to face whatever horrors awaited us in the darkness of the forest. As we emerged from the cottage, the full moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting an eerie silver light over the clearing. The air was thick with tension, alive with the chittering and rustling of unseen creatures lurking just beyond the edge of visibility. Ezra raised his staff, muttering words in a language I didn't recognize. The tip began to glow with a soft, warm light that pushed back the encroaching shadows. I focused on the moonstone in my hand, willing it to shine brighter. To my amazement, it responded, its glow intensifying until it rivaled Ezra's staff. For a moment, all was still. Then, with a roar that shook the very ground, the Skinwalker burst from the tree line. It was even more terrifying than I remembered, its fur matted with blood and ichor, its eyes blazing with inhuman hunger and rage. "Stand your ground," Ezra shouted as the beast charged towards us. "Focus on the light. Don't let your fear control you." I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to flee, but I remembered Ezra's words about courage, about the power of standing against the darkness. I planted my feet firmly, raised the moonstone high, and focused all my will on pushing back the encroaching horror. The Skinwalker faltered as it entered the circle of light created by Ezra's staff and my moonstone. It snarled in pain and fury, circling us warily. I could see its form shifting and warping, as if it couldn't decide on a single shape. One moment it was bear-like, the next more lupine, then something altogether alien and indescribable. "It's weakening," Ezra called out. "Keep focusing, we can drive it back." But even as he spoke, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. More shapes were emerging from the forest, twisted, nightmarish forms that defied description. The Skinwalker hadn't come alone. "Ezra," I cried out in warning, "there are more of them." The old guardian's face set in grim determination. "The barrier between worlds is weaker than I feared," he said. "We need to close it, or more will keep coming through." He began to chant, his voice rising and falling in a complex rhythm. The air around us seemed to thicken, charged with an electric energy that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The monsters pressed closer, held at bay only by our dwindling circle of light. "The grimoire," Ezra shouted between verses of his chant. "Your grandmother's grimoire. There's a sealing spell, find it." With shaking hands I pulled out the ancient book, flipping through its pages desperately. Strange symbols and arcane diagrams flashed before my eyes, incomprehensible yet somehow familiar. Finally, I found a page titled "The Great Seal" in my grandmother's neat handwriting. "I found it," I called out. "What do I do?" "Read it," Ezra replied, his voice strained as he continued his own incantation. "Put everything you have into the words. Believe in them. Make them real." I began to read, my voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each word. The language was strange, ancient, but it felt right on my tongue, as if I had always known how to speak it. As I read, I felt a power building within me, a connection to something vast and incomprehensible. The monsters howled and raged, pressing against our failing light. The Skinwalker lunged forward, its claws raking the air mere inches from my face. But I didn't falter, didn't stop reading. I poured everything I had into the words, my fear, my determination, my newfound sense of purpose. As I spoke the final word of the incantation, there was a moment of perfect stillness. Then, with a sound like reality itself tearing, a blinding light erupted from the ground beneath our feet. It shot upwards in a column of pure energy, piercing the night sky. The monster screamed, not in rage now, but in terror and pain. I watched in awe as they were pulled towards the light, their bodies twisting and dissolving as they were drawn in. The skinwalker fought the hardest, its claws leaving deep gouges in the earth as it struggled against the inexorable pull. But in the end, even it couldn't resist. With a final defiant roar, it too was sucked into the pillar of light. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. The clearing was plunged into darkness, lit only by the soft glow of the moon and stars above. I stood there, panting, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Slowly I became aware of Ezra's hand on my shoulder. "Well done, child," he said softly. "Well done indeed. You've closed the breach, at least for now. The barrier between worlds is restored." I looked at him, seeing the weariness etched deep in his face. "Is it over?" I asked. Ezra shook his head slowly. "No, not over. Never over. The battle between light and dark, between order and chaos, it's eternal. But for now, at least we've won a reprieve." He gestured around the clearing. "Look closely. What do you see?" I blinked, looking around. At first I saw nothing but shadows and moonlight. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I began to notice things. Shimmering lines of energy crisscrossing the ground. Strange, half-seen shapes flitting at the edge of vision. The forest suddenly seemed alive in a way I had never noticed before, pulsing with a hidden energy. "The veil between worlds," Ezra explained. "Now that you've used your power, you'll always be able to see it, to see the truth of reality that most people never notice." I nodded slowly, a mixture of awe and trepidation filling me. "So what happens now?" I asked. Ezra smiled, a mix of pride and sadness in his eyes. "Now, my dear, you have a choice to make. A real choice, not the rushed decision we faced earlier. You've seen the truth of our world, felt the power within you. You can choose to embrace this path, to become a guardian like your grandmother before you, or you can choose to forget, to return to the life you knew before." I looked down at the grimoire in my hands, feeling the weight of generations of knowledge and responsibility. Then I gazed out at the forest, seeing it with new eyes, the shimmering energies, the hidden realms just beyond normal perception. I thought of the terror I'd faced, but also of the exhilaration of standing against the darkness. "If I choose to become a guardian," I said slowly, "what would that mean? What would my life be like?" Ezra sighed, leaning heavily on his staff. "It would not be an easy life. You would need to learn the old ways, master ancient magics, and stand vigilant against threats most people can't even imagine. You would have to keep secrets from those you love, always living with one foot in this world and one in the hidden realms." He paused, his gaze distant. "But it is also a life of purpose, of meaning beyond what most ever know. You would be part of something greater than yourself, a defender of reality itself, and you would see wonders beyond imagination, experience the true depth and breadth of existence." I nodded, considering his words carefully. "And if I choose to forget?" "Then I will brew a potion that will erase the memories of these events," Ezra replied. "You'll return to your life in the city, remembering this only as a strange dream. The cabin and these woods will hold no more mystery for you than any other place." I closed my eyes, weighing the options. The rational part of me longed for the simplicity of my old life, my job, my friends, the comfortable routines I'd built. But another part, a part that had awakened in these woods, rebelled against the idea of forgetting, of turning away from the truth I'd discovered. I opened my eyes, my decision made. "I choose to remember," I said, my voice steady. "I choose to become a guardian." Ezra's face broke into a wide smile, years seeming to fall away from him. "I had hoped you would say that," he said. "Your grandmother would be proud." He straightened up, suddenly all business. "We have much work to do then. The breach may be sealed for now, but there are always other weak points, other dangers, and you have much to learn." As if on cue, a cool breeze swept through the clearing, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers, not menacing now, but welcoming, approving. I felt a connection to the forest, to the hidden worlds beyond, that I knew would only grow stronger with time. "Where do we start?" I asked, eager to begin my new journey. Ezra gestured towards the cottage. "First, rest. You've been through much today, and the path ahead is long. Tomorrow we'll begin your training in earnest." As we walked back to the cottage, I glanced over my shoulder at the moonlit clearing. For a moment I thought I saw a shimmering figure, a woman with kind eyes and a familiar smile. My grandmother. She nodded once, then faded away like mist in the morning sun. I smiled, feeling a sense of continuity, of belonging to something greater than myself. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew I was where I was meant to be. Inside the cottage, as Ezra busied himself brewing tea and gathering books for my upcoming lessons, I settled into the worn armchair by the fire. I opened my grandmother's grimoire, running my fingers over the pages filled with her neat handwriting and intricate diagrams. On the inside cover I noticed an inscription I hadn't seen before. "To those who guard the boundaries between worlds, who stand against the darkness with light in their hearts, remember always, courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The greatest magic lies within you." I smiled, tracing the words with my finger. As the fire crackled and Ezra hummed an ancient tune while he worked, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. The world outside might be full of dangers and dark magic, but in this moment, in this place, I was exactly where I needed to be. My journey as a guardian was just beginning, and though I knew it would be filled with challenges and terrors I could scarcely imagine, I also knew I was ready to face them. With the wisdom of those who came before me, the guidance of Ezra, and the power I was only beginning to understand within myself, I would learn to navigate the hidden realms and protect the boundaries between worlds. As I drifted off to sleep, lulled by the gentle scratching of Ezra's quill and the soft glow of the moonstone on the table beside me, I dreamed of forests filled with wonders, of battles against shadow, and of a legacy stretching back through time immemorial. In the morning my new life would begin in earnest, but for now I rested, safe in the knowledge that I had found my true calling. The whispers in the woods had led me home,